So we're still on macroeconomic demand side policy. We've talked about monetary policy in the previous class. So today we're going to fiscal policy. And when we talk about fiscal policy, it simply means the use of government spending, government borrowing, and taxation to influence the economy. So here I wrote fiscal policy. This involves government using spending and taxation to influence the economy. It can also be affected by government fiscal policy. Government spends on the following areas: education, healthcare, defense, welfare payments, such as pensions and unemployment benefits. So the use of fiscal policy is to increase the AD. That if government is coming up with any policy, it's because government wants to influence the aggregate demand within the economy. So influencing the aggregate demand means output will increase within the economy. And you know the aggregate demand, we have the consumption, investment, government spending, export minus import. So if government wants to increase this, government has to use the policy like monetary policy or fiscal policy. I think you get what fiscal policy is here.
Yes.
Therefore, fiscal policy, we have the fiscal surplus or the fiscal deficit. So fiscal is all about the budget. So we have budget surplus or budget deficit. So why do we call it fiscal surplus? We call it fiscal surplus because it simply means that government spending is lesser than government revenue. So government is making more in terms of its receipts than what it spends. So government revenue exceeds government expenditure. That is fiscal surplus. And when it comes to fiscal deficit, it simply means government expenditure exceeds government revenue. I think it's clear. So that's the difference between fiscal surplus or fiscal deficit, or budget surplus or budget deficit. They are the same. Any question about that? So that takes us to fiscal policy and aggregate demand. For aggregate demand is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus export minus import. So an increase in tax. So let's put it this way, because we're talking about fiscal policy. So it simply means we're talking about taxation. So an increase, how can taxation increase aggregate demand? Here I go. An increase in tax revenue may increase government spending, which will in turn increase aggregate demand. So if tax revenue for government increases, it means government will have much more available to them to spend. So government spending would increase, which implies that the aggregate demand would also increase. Get the point here? An increase in tax revenue means government will have much money available to them to spend. And government spending is increasing. Government spending is one of the components of aggregate demand. So if government spending is increasing, it simply means aggregate demand would increase. I think the point is clear.
Yes, sir.
That's one way in which aggregate demand can increase. Another one is if government spending doesn't change, but tax rate falls, AD is also expected to rise. If government does not change its spending, but reduces taxes, it simply means income tax has reduced, corporate tax has reduced, value-added tax has reduced. It increases consumption or investment within the economy. So aggregate demand is expected to rise. Get the point here. Government is not increasing its spending. So government spending is staying constant. But at the same time, government has reduced its taxation, maybe income tax, profit tax, or value-added tax. All these taxes increase. If they are reduced or cut, it increases spending for firms and individuals. Firms will be able to spend more on investments, on capital goods. That is I, which is part of the component of aggregate demand. So I will increase. Individuals will be able to consume more. Spending will increase for consumers. They will be able to buy durables. So that increases consumption. So C plus I, C and I will increase. And if C and I increases, AD will increase. Do you get the point here? That's another way to increase aggregate demand. And I said, and the last one, the government could also increase AD by raising both government spending and taxes, but raising taxes by less than increasing the government spending. Another way to increase aggregate demand is by government increasing taxes and at the same time increasing its spending. But government would increase spending more than taxes. So if government spending increases more than taxes, it will also increase aggregate demand. Is it clear?
Yes.
Any question about aggregate demand? So in summary, a rise in the budget deficit or a fall in the budget surplus is likely to increase aggregate demand. This is called expansionary fiscal policy. So there's what we call expansionary fiscal policy, and we have what we call expansionary and contractionary. For expansionary fiscal policy, it occurs if there's budget deficit or there's a reduction in the budget surplus. Reduction in budget surplus or increase in budget deficit means government continues to spend more. Do you get the point here? Government is spending more than what it's receiving in terms of revenue. So that will bring about budget deficit, and that will increase aggregate demand. So a fall in surplus, an increase in deficit will bring about an increase in the aggregate demand. In contrary, a fall in budget deficit, a rise in budget surplus will bring about a fall in aggregate demand, and that is what we call contractionary fiscal policy. So if the government of a country wants to reduce aggregate demand within the economy, government will use what we call contractionary fiscal policy. If government wants to increase aggregate demand within the economy, probably because it's recession, government will use expansionary fiscal policy. Do you understand the difference here?
Yes, sir.
So for AD to increase, we need expansionary fiscal policy, and that might lead to what? An increase in budget deficit or a reduction in budget surplus. And for the AD to reduce, we need contractionary fiscal policy, which might bring about a rise in government budget or budget surplus or a fall in budget deficit. I think it's clear.
Yes.
Any question about that?
No.
Then for fiscal stance, we have what we call fiscal stance, which simply means the position of the budget. It's either a surplus, a deficit, or a neutral. It is neutral if there's no change in government expenditure and government spending. Government expenditure and government revenue. I think it's clear.
Yes.
Any question about that?
No.
So that takes us to monetary policy and aggregate demand. Are you there? Are you there?
Yes.
Okay. So for monetary policy can be used. Monetary policies such as interest rate and quantitative easing can be used to influence aggregate demand. So we have what we call expansionary monetary policy, such as lowering the interest rate or increasing quantitative easing. So when you lower the interest rate, it allows more borrowing. Increasing quantitative easing increases money supply. Those two will bring about expansionary monetary policy, and it is expected to increase the aggregate demand. It will shift aggregate demand to the right. So whatever expansionary policy we use, either monetary or fiscal, will bring about a rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve, and the short-run equilibrium output will be increasing too. So here I wrote, therefore, expansionary policies such as a rise in government spending or a fall in interest rate will shift the aggregate demand curve rightward from AD1 to AD2, and in the short run, the equilibrium output will rise from Y1 to Y2, but with an increase in the price level from P1 to P2. So look at figure 1 here. Figure 1 is a typical expansionary demand side policy, either monetary or fiscal. Expansionary fiscal policy will increase aggregate demand. Expansionary monetary policy will increase aggregate demand. So this is how it increases it. It will increase the aggregate demand curve. You shift it rightward from AD1 to AD2, and the real output level, the short-run equilibrium real level output will increase from Y1 to Y2, and it is expected for the price to also rise from P1 to P2. Do you understand expansionary here?
Yes, sir.
Then we have contractionary fiscal policy, contractionary demand side policy. So for contractionary demand side policy, a fall in government spending, that's contractionary. A rise in interest rate, that is contractionary. Both of them will shift the aggregate demand curve leftward from AD1 to AD2, and the short-run equilibrium output will reduce from Y1, or will contract from Y1 to Y2, and the price level is expected to fall from P1 to P2. So any contractionary policy, demand-side policy, will bring about a fall in the price level. Any expansionary demand-side policy will bring about a rise in the price level. I think it's clear. Any question about that?
No.
Great. So that takes us to the strengths and weaknesses of demand-side policies. Are you there?
Yes.
So the strengths and weaknesses of demand-side policies. We're talking about the strengths and weaknesses. We're talking about how demand-side policies are effective and why they are not effective. So we have the Keynesian and we have the classical economy. So they have their own point of view regarding demand-side policies. So here I wrote, Keynesian economists favor the use of both fiscal and monetary demand-side policies, while classical economists tend to argue that fiscal policies are ineffective, that government should focus mainly on monetary policy. For Keynesian, they believe government should use both fiscal and monetary policy when it comes to demand-side policies. But for the classical, they believe fiscal policies are never going to be effective. That government should mainly focus on monetary policy, which is simply interest rate. Are you with me? So we start with the first argument. It's based on the speed of adjustment. Are you there?
Yes.
For the speed of adjustment, I wrote, Keynesian economists argue that if firms, individuals, and government all spend less than it's needed to get to the economy to full employment, the economy can remain depressed for a long time. For Keynesian, they argue that for the economy to move out of recession, government, all economic agents, government, firms, and individuals, they have to spend until the economy reaches its full employment level.
What do you mean by spend?
Spending, government should spend. Government should spend on infrastructure. Government should spend on whatever government has to spend on. Unemployment benefits, infrastructure, whatever government has to spend on. Government should spend on it. Individuals must also continue to spend. Firms must also continue to spend to ensure that the economy is at its full employment level. Because if spending increases from consumers, firms will be able to employ more workers to the extent that the economy will have full employment. But if the economy is unable to get to full employment, the economy will still continue to be in depression. That is according to Keynesian. But the classical, they argue that unemployment is not the problem. That an economy can be at unemployment and at the same time increase output, because output is not a demand side situation, it is a supply side situation. So government should focus mainly on supply side policy instead of thinking about demand side policy. That is the argument against speed of adjustment. Do you get the point I'm making here? For classical, they believe that the economy can adjust quickly if government focuses on supply side policies instead of demand side policy, because unemployment is not a supply side, is not a demand side situation. And when you look at unemployment, really, unemployment mostly some of the time it's based on output. If output increases, firms might be able to employ more workers. If government is spending on maybe monetary policy like a fall in interest rates, that might increase borrowing. Therefore, people will start spending more. Do you understand? So for classical, they believe the economy can adjust quicker even with long-term unemployment, because unemployment is not a demand side situation, rather it's a supply side situation. I think unemployment is clear there.
Yes.
And classical, the argument, the opinion of the classical and the opinion of the Keynesian is clear regarding the speed of adjustment. Great. Then the second one, conflicting policies. Yeah, I wrote. If there is high unemployment in the economy in recession, Keynesian economists would argue that government should use both expansionary fiscal and monetary policy, while classical economists argue that monetary policy should be expansionary, while fiscal policy should be contractionary. So we have here high unemployment situation when there's recession. For Keynesian, they believe government should use both fiscal and monetary policy to solve the high unemployment rate during recession. But for classical, they believe expansionary monetary policy should be used and contractionary fiscal policy should be used. For the classical, they mostly believe that if government continues to use fiscal policy, government will continue to run on a debt. The national debt will continue to rise over time. So that's why classical economists believe that monetary policy is more ideal, because monetary policy goes mostly to the private sector. Do you get the point here, please?
Yes, sir.
Good. The third one, the national debt. In recession, expansionary fiscal policy can be used as a demand-side policy to increase aggregate demand. However, this will increase the size of the national debt. This has a negative impact. For Keynesian, they argued that as long as government can print money to finance its deficit without raising inflation or borrow money from financial market, then the national debt is not a problem in the short run. So for the national debt, for classical economists, they believe if government continues to use fiscal policy, yes, aggregate demand will rise, but national debt will continue to rise over time. And that is not ideal for an economy, because the economy is running over through debt. But for the Keynesian, they argue that if the government of the country can print the money needed to meet up with its deficit without raising inflation or borrowing more money, then national debt in the short run is not going to be a problem. So that's different. That's their own argument against the national debt when it comes to demand side policy. Is it clear? The next one, the rate of interest. Are you there? The rate of interest in a recession, economists agree that the central bank should cut interest rate to stimulate aggregate demand. That means to increase aggregate demand. However, interest rate may be as low as possible, and AD might not increase. Therefore, it has limitations. This allows the central bank to use quantitative easing. For the interest rate, yes, both Keynesian and classical, they believe using interest rate to stimulate aggregate demand is ideal. But most of the time, a lower interest rate might not increase aggregate demand. So if it does not increase aggregate demand, then the central bank will start thinking about quantitative easing. So which simply means that interest rate also has its own limitation. Because without limitation into interest rate, without any limitation of interest rate, we won't be talking about quantitative easing. Remember the last time, yesterday when we talked about quantitative easing, we said there's quantitative easing because the interest rate is as low as possible. There's nothing they could do about it anymore. Then they come up with quantitative easing to increase aggregate demand. So if interest rate has its limitation, then we start thinking about quantitative easing. Do you get the point here?
Yes,
It's great. Then we have quantitative easing itself. So what is the argument about quantitative easing? For economists disagreed about the effectiveness of quantitative easing. Some argue that it boosts the aggregate demand because households and firms borrow to spend on real goods and services. Others argue that it mainly pushes up asset prices. Households and firms borrow money, but instead of buying new cars or new buildings, they buy second-hand houses, which pushes up their prices, but not increasing AD. Now, for quantitative easing increases money supply within the economy, which increases borrowing within the economy. Yes or no? But as soon as borrowing increases, households and firms are supposed to borrow to invest in capital goods or equipment, and the individuals should invest to start buying new goods or services. Yes or no? But most of the time, both households and firms, they would not buy new goods and services. They would rather buy second-hand goods and services. And that pushes the price of second-handed cars and houses up without increasing aggregate demand. Because if aggregate demand has to increase, new goods has to be sold. Investment and consumption of new goods bring about increase in aggregate demand, not second-handed goods, because those second-handed goods are part of goods that were produced before. So they were part of the aggregate demand before now. So you cannot add them anymore because they were already there. So for aggregate demand to increase, investment has to start increasing, and consumption of new goods and services must rise. But if people borrow money for second-handed cars or second-handed durables, that does not increase aggregate demand. That is the argument about quantitative easing. I think the point is clear. Then the reserve assets or liquidity requirements. Here I wrote, the use of reserve requirement doesn't have impact on the amount banks lend to their customers. Therefore, focusing on interest rates to achieve inflation targets may be considered ideal. Capital requirements or reserve requirements. The central bank might use reserve requirements, liquidity ratio, to ensure that banks are able to pay their customers whenever they need to borrow them, whenever the customer demand for their money, because their money is always a liability to the banks. But most of the time, banks will still borrow more will still lend customers more than what they even have in reserve. So that means focusing on interest rate will checkmate the irresponsibility of banks. So not reserve asset ratio or requirement. Is it clear? So the weakness about reserve asset requirement is that it does not stop commercial banks, from lending out more money to their customers. So for them to be able to reduce what they lend out, interest rate has to be in place, not reserve asset requirements. I think it's clear. Yes. We go to the size of the multiplier. Are you there?
Yes.
For the size of the multiplier, I wrote, classical economists tend to argue that extra government spending forces out private sector spending, and this increases budget deficit and inflation without any extra output. However, Keynesian economists argue that the multiplier is positive and can be large if government spending and tax charges are carefully targeted. According to the classical economists, they argue that increasing government spending pushes out private sector spending. And if private sector does not spend, output will not rise, because most of the time, it is the private sector that increases output, not government. So if government continues to spend over time, it forces the private sector out of the economy. Then before you know it, the government will continue to run in deficit and inflation will continue to rise because output will be less. Demand will be more than supply. Then inflation increases. No extra output and government will be running through deficit and also inflation. That's according to the classical economists. But for the Keynesian, they argue that with increasing government spending, and if taxes are targeted and government spending are targeted carefully, output will increase and aggregate demand will increase within the economy. That's the difference between classical and Keynesian. Classical economists mostly argue that they don't want government spending because government spending leads to budget deficit, according to the classical economists. But for Keynesian, they believe government just have to target whatever they want to spend on or whatever tax they want to charge. And that would increase aggregate demand within the economy. I think it's clear.
Yes.
The next one is time lags. And when we talk about time lags, we're talking about the time which, how long does it take for demand side policies to be effective? That is the point here. So yeah, demand side policies takes time before they materialize. As a result, the policy may fail because the economic situation changes over time. Demand side policies need to be focused on changing the aggregate demand within a short period of time. So demand side policies are not meant to change for a long time. Like, oh, you want to build infrastructure, you want to use the demand side policy. Before you, maybe building a bridge might take 4 or 5 years. But within the 4 or 5 years, the economic situation would have changed. Exchange rate might have changed, inflation might have come in, different things would have changed over time. So how do you plan? So most of the time government should try to use demand side policy for the current situation or the present situation, not long-term situation. That is why it's always going to be short-run aggregate supply when the aggregate demand is shifting to the right. Is it clear? Or to the left? Any question about that? And the last is fine-tuning. When you talk about fine-tuning, it simply means the practice of making small adjustments. So the economy is not going to be stable. So every now and then there's going to be a situation. And each situation that comes, you just have to fine-tune to adjust it to suit the situation, to solve the situation or to solve the problem of that situation. So that's what fine-tuning is about. So yeah, I wrote, this refers to the practice of making small increment adjustments to monetary and fiscal policies to stabilize the economy and manage aggregate demand and prices. So for fine-tuning, it simply means whatever the problem is today, we try to adjust fiscal or monetary policy to suit the situation. That is what fine-tuning is about. Any question about it? So that's about the strength and weakness of demand-side policy. And that ends paper 2. Oh, paper 1, I think. Paper 2, yes, paper 2. Yeah, thank you. Let me see.